I wanted to share this project with you from the University of Melbourne because though it's a next generation learning space, it's quite different to the learning space from Monash University I shared with you in my previous video. And I thought some of the differences between the two might help you when you're thinking about your next generation of learning spaces. So what happens when you don't have big open spaces to refurbish or rework or repurpose as large flat floor learning spaces that give you results like this with lots of natural light, big flat floor open spaces, lots of circulation? What happens when you have a space such as this, which is an old tiered lecture theatre with a column running through the middle of the building? And in a room which not only has a column running through it, but has two entry points at different levels, an internal entry 1.5 meters higher than the external entry. And you're working in a building that is heritage and it doesn't have these large windows, so you know you're not going to get lots of natural light coming into the space. So this project that I want to share with you is what's called the Learning Lab at the University of Melbourne, and it's 10 years old. And what I find interesting about that 10 years is, in the 10 years that I've been working on learning spaces, is the ideas in this we are still seeing in contemporary learning spaces being designed today. The idea of small group work, collaboration, using AV systems to share information throughout the classroom. And this is an early idea, some of the early ideas I'm going to take you through of how we started thinking about this space of supporting collaboration and how we were going to deal with the different levels in the room and how we were going to deal with the existing column. And one of the very early ideas was this idea of creating these platforms through the space and using those platforms to create a sense of semi-private learning spaces within the room. Yes, you could still come together as one large group, but the emphasis was really on the smaller group work. And as we work through these designs, we refined that idea of introducing these tiers, connecting the lower external entry and the higher internal entry by creating these semi-private zones. And as the idea refined more of understanding better how these tiers might work, this is the lower external entry, the higher internal entry, and then you can really start getting a sense of how these spaces were being defined as these semi-private learning spaces. So one of the biggest differences, I think, between this project and the previous project that I shared with you is the feel of the space. And it's this idea of creating learning spaces with potential. The idea that a classroom doesn't just have to be about sharing information and getting information across. It's not just about the AV systems and the furniture, but that the feel of the space contributes to the learning process. And it's the idea that when you walk into a classroom or a learning space, that you feel this is a space where I can do my best work. This is a space I want to be in. And we really grappled with that idea of how were we going to introduce that feeling into this room. And then we remembered this project done by Alvar Aalto, the Finnish pavilion, where he introduced these ribbons and he wrapped advertising material about Finland on these. And this was the pavilion. And we thought, well, we could, if we imagined this room that we were working in as a heritage room and we introduced these ribbons through the space, and instead of putting advertising on the ribbons, we would use those ribbons to hold information being shared with the students. So we'd use to hold the LCD screens, pin boards, writing boards, and things like that. And we saw this as a way of introducing some architecture into this learning space that would contribute to how the room feels. And this is a final render that we did when we all agreed as a group this was really the way to go. The orange walls here are the existing walls, and what we did was we introduced these floating ribbons through the space, and on those ribbons would be the LCD screens and the writing boards. And you could see the sense of introducing the curves, the more organic shape into the rooms and defining these semi-private learning spaces, and this idea of the platforms through the space. So we've got the lower entry, you come into the lower platform, so if you're in a wheelchair you can access these two tables, and then you go up some steps to another platform, more steps to another platform, and then some final steps to the external one. And then hidden in the back here is a little breakout space for a smaller group of students that can work there. And you can see how the existing column has been integrated. And these are some glass balustrades that provide protection between the spaces, but don't, between the levels, but don't get in the way of groups being able to see each other. And this is a photo of the final completed project, and I think this gives you a sense of how the tiers work and an idea of how the tables do have the semi-private space, so that the group work is really encouraged, but you still have vision across to all the tables. And what was really important is this idea of a central space where students could gather or mingle, or a lecturer or a teacher or a tutor could stand in the middle and actually be able to see all the tables. And you can get a sense of here of how we've used these ribbons to then hold the LCD screens and the writing boards and other information that's shared with it, and the existing walls in the background, the orange walls of the existing room. Another feature that was really important in designing this was understanding that students coming into this space want to have their personal belongings near them. They don't like the idea of having lockers at the entry to a building. So every pod here has some hooks where you can hang your coats. It has storage for your bags, and that's replicated in all the pods. This is a view from the other side, and you can get a sense of these ribbons. It's got hooks for your coats or jackets, writing boards, LCD screens, and then storage, and then the pods here. And again, you can get a sense of the lower entry, the higher entry, and these platforms running through the space. So one of the really unique ideas about this project was the design of the tables for each pod. For those of you that have been working with involved in designing collaborative learning spaces, I'm sure you've come across a wide range of table shapes being used. Triangular, bean-shaped, oval, rectangular. I think there's many examples of them all, but what was quite interesting about this one was working with the stakeholders, the idea of creating a reconfigurable table, which is made up of two leaves around a central pivot point that you can actually rotate to make a bigger table or a smaller table depending on what you're doing. And this plan gives you some idea. So this is a plan of the space with the 5 tables. And the table's comprised of 2 leaves pivot around a central pivot point. And you can see, depending how you pivot the shapes, it will give you different configurations. So if you want to have someone standing in the middle of the space, you can configure the tables this way so everyone is looking towards the middle of the space. If you want to break the group of 8 into smaller groups of 4 and 4, you can pivot the table into almost 2 separate tables. So you can have a group of 4 working here and 4 working there. And because of the way the AV system's been designed, there's fixed computers, 2 fixed computers at each table. Or if you want to have a more private group work here, you can orientate the table leaves differently so that it's orientated towards the LCD screen and the writing boards, and leaves this bit of space at the front where the group can mingle, walk, or a single person or a couple of people from that group can present to the front. When we talk about innovating, it's really important when you set out on this journey that you understand that in innovating, you're going to make mistakes. There are going to be things that when you look back on it, you're going to realize that haven't worked out how you hoped. But that's the nature of innovating. Otherwise, you're simply copying. And there were a couple of things that happened on this project where we were really pushing the boundaries. And I should say, the title of this slide is enhancing learning through collaboration and creativity. And the collaboration on this project was extremely important. this is not the project of one mind, but of many, of AV designers, educational designers, lecturers, architects, engineers, space planners. A lot of people put a lot of effort into designing this one space and thinking about it. And right from the beginning, the idea was there was not going to be a front of house. And we know this discussion is still being had 10 years later, that there should not be a front of house, that we really shouldn't, that lecturers or teachers shouldn't be behind a desk but roaming through the space, especially in a collaborative learning space such as this. But well into the design, as this idea was shared with the wider teaching community at the university, it became clear that there was not going to be full support for this type of space if there was not some sort of a front of house. Now, from the beginning, there was always going to be a place where a large image could be presented, which was this wall. But right towards the end, it was decided to bring in a teacher's lecturer's desk, which was squeezed into this corner. And you can see it's probably, the word squeezed is right. It was less than ideal trying to fit it in here, but that's worked. The other lesson learned is the AB system. So bear in mind, this is 10 years ago, and the ideas of sharing information through the class was quite new back then and required an extremely complex AB system. Not only could you share the information from this screen to the 4 other screens around the room, and they could share the information back from here, but there were also 2 fixed computers at each desk, and the information from these computers could be shared to those screens, as well as there was a document camera for each of the pods, and the information from that could be shared. And this required a really complex system to operate. And the reality is, if you need to spend 10 minutes at the beginning of a class learning how to use an AV system, then the AV system is getting in the way of learning and it's not helping. So in the next video, I'm going to share with you another next generation learning space. And again, it's one repurposing a lecture theatre. But this one's a little different again, because this is going to be a flat-forward VR research and learning space. And that will be in the next video. Thank you.